Hello, fellow Rebel Capitals. Hope you're well. Let's get right into this story from Reuters. And it's about Putin coming out in a recent speech and saying this is going to be the most dangerous decade since World War II. And quite frankly, I agree with him. And there are a lot of things that he says in this speech that we're going to go over that are pretty commonsensical. It's tough to dispute. I mean, obviously, I always have to say I'm not a fan of Putin. I don't like the fact that he invaded Ukraine and blah, 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 blah. You have to throw out those stupid disclaimers, just like you did when you were against the vaccine mandates, saying that, this doesn't mean that I'm an anti-vaxxer or anything like that. You always had to throw out that stupid disclaimer. And now you got to do the same thing with Putin, or else people just light up the chat and say, "Oh, we got to do something. We got to do something." Oh, why do you love Putin so much? You got me. Oh my, I'm coming out of the closet as a Putin lover. Just totally ridiculous arguments. But let's get into this story because I think there's some validity here to what he is saying. And regardless of whether he's a bad dude, which I think he is, he's got some good points. So let's go over this. Putin says world faces most dangerous decade since World War II. And one thing that why I want to focus on Putin doing this is because, you could say, well, George, Iran is saying the same thing, or George, Saudi Arabia is saying the same thing. Right, but they don't currently have 6,000 nuclear warheads pointed at us. And that's why I'm putting a little more emphasis here, as I think we should, on what Putin is saying and what his, according to him, what his position is. So he said on Thursday, the world faced the most dangerous decade since World War II as Western elites scrambled to prevent the inevitable crumbling of the global dominance of the United States and its allies. Again, I don't care how much you hate Russia, and they could be an evil empire. And I've had some people even argue with me on Twitter that their people are somehow inherently evil, and they have been for thousands of years, and they will be thousands of years into the future. But even if that's your worldview, tough to dispute. What are you saying here about the Western elites scrambling to prevent the inevitable crumbling of the global dominance of the West? Especially when you look at the West's policies and how, if you're another country, you can just sit back and watch the West just completely self-destruct. In a broadside against Washington and its allies, which he accused of inciting the conflict in Ukraine, I don't know if I'd agree with him there. I think that's debatable. I mean, at the end of the day, you got to blame Putin for invading Ukraine. I mean, he's the one that made the decision, obviously. Now, was it as simple as just good versus evil? Did he maybe have a legitimate reason? Or I shouldn't say a legitimate reason. I should say, could he maybe have had an argument? Maybe. But again, he was the guy that pulled the trigger, figuratively speaking. What he cast as dangerous, bloody, dirty geopolitical game that was sowing chaos across the world. Yep. I mean, got to agree with him there. Although I would say, Putin, you're a part of that dangerous, bloody game, my friend. Ultimately, he said the West would have to talk to Russia and other major powers about the future of the world. You going to disagree with him there? And what this really boils down to is what is more powerful, the dollar or energy? I think the world is waking up to the fact that energy is more important than pieces of paper, even if they're green. Therefore, assuming for a moment that Russia and the BRIC nations control the energy, then to his point, whether we like it or not, whether we hate it, whether it's the wrong thing to do, whether you're doing a deal with the devil, Unfortunately, we might not have a choice. The major powers of the world, the West, will have to sit down and talk to the people that control the energy. And you say, George, well, we have a lot of energy. You're right, we do. We do. But we don't have any refining capacity, or we have very little. So how long is that going to take to come back online? Just assuming if there were somehow the political appetite for more refining here in the United States. And I talk about the political appetite because there has to be the political appetite for the capital to be allocated, because capital is going to go where it's treated best. And if it's not treated well here in the States, because of all this rhetoric against fossil fuels and it's the devil and all of us are going to be driving an electric car, the government is going to force us to drive an electric car by 2035 or whatever it is in California. This is not how you incentivized refiners and producers to produce more energy, more diesel, which is really hitting home today. Just did a whiteboard video on it. Boy, I tell you what, out of all the problems we have, and we can sit here and talk about the Eurodollar system, the global monetary system, we can talk about the Fed's balance sheet, we can talk about QT, we can talk about spiking interest rates, we can talk about the yield curve. Diesel is by far our biggest problem. By far. It's problem 1 through 10 as far as how critical it is to not just the future, but to the next 3 months, to this winter, not just in Europe, but in the United States. And I think that's one of the things that Putin's pointing out here. We are standing at a historical frontier. Ahead is probably the most dangerous, unpredictable, and at the same time important decade since World War II. Agreed. I guess he said Russia did not consider the West to be an enemy, despite current phase of confrontation. And he goes on to talk about sending troops in there. I mean, look, you can't say that one side's right and one side's wrong. I mean, it's nonsense. Both governments are wrong. Both governments are evil. All governments. I mean, show me the government in the world right now that isn't evil. I mean, you might be able to pick out a handful, but for the most part, especially in the major countries, these governments are crooked as a scenic railway, and they're all crooks. They're all criminals. Russia, U.S., Canada, Ukraine, all of them. To sit there and say that one is good and one is evil is just total nonsense. So tens of thousands of people have been killed while the West has imposed the most severe sanctions in history in Russia, one of the world's biggest suppliers of natural resources. So I don't know if he's talking about tens of thousands of people killed in Ukraine, which you got to give the blame to him on that one. Or probably what he's talking about is tens of thousands of people that have been killed in the West, killed by higher gas prices, energy prices, or just, killed by poverty. They couldn't afford to turn the heat on, or they couldn't afford food. I mean, I remember looking at a story last night on the news in the Northeast here in the United States of some gal who her husband died. She's probably 80 years old or something. Her husband died like a couple months ago. Now all of a sudden she's the sole provider for the family. And she says she literally can't afford to heat her house. And what she's doing right now, just to literally survive, is she's turning down the heat as low as it will go and just covering up with blankets. And then in order to even excuse me, and in order to even afford that energy bill or gas bill, she's having to cut back on the amount of food that she eats. This is right here in the United States. So asked about nuclear escalation, Putin said the danger of nukes usage would exist as long as nuclear weapons exist. Well, again, tough to dispute that. This power over the world is what the so-called West has put on the line in its game. But the game is dangerous, bloody, I would say dirty. Putin, the sower of the wind, as they say, will reap the storm. I mean, I think that's pretty much holds true for all governments. I don't know if that's exclusive to the West. He says, I've also believed and believe in common sense, so I'm convinced that sooner or later the new centers of the multipolar world order and the West will have to start the equal conversation about the future we share. The earlier, the better. This, I think, is by far the most important thing that he said. This is pretty much why I wanted to do the video. Let's read this one more time. Very powerful here. And again, even if you hate Putin, even if you hate Russians, even if you think they're just somehow evil to their core, the bottom line is he's got a lot of power. He's got a lot of energy. He's got a lot of commodities. And at the end of the day, we're finding out the hard way that energy is more important than green pieces of paper. So you got to listen to what he's saying here. Whether we like it or not, we can't change the fact that he's got a lot of leverage due to the commodities that he controls. So let's read this again. I've always believed and believe in common sense. So I am convinced that sooner or later, the new centers of the multipolar world, the new centers. See what he's saying there? He's saying, I think what he's trying to imply, the BRIC nations, the countries that are coming together here, and I would argue have been forced together to a certain degree based on what the West has done in terms of sanctions and the SWIFT and freezing dollar assets and whatnot. But he's talking about this new group of countries that controls a lot of the energy coming together. And this is kind of the new world order, if you will. It's a multipolar world order, and the West, implying that the West is not part of this group, will have to start an equal conversation about the future we all share. And the earlier, the better. Now, whether he is sincere, I mean, hopefully he's sincere here. Who knows, though? I mean, he's like any other politician. You can't really believe too much of what he says. But, you know, I think it's important that we listen to how he is describing the world and how he views the future. I mean, a lot of this really reminds me of what Zoltan Pozar has said and my good buddy Luke Groman with the power shifting away from the financial economy and the financial producers, meaning the West, to the hard assets and the countries that control those hard assets. Putin said he thought constantly of the Russian losses in Ukraine, but only Russia could guarantee the territorial integrity. I don't know about that. I don't really have an opinion one way or the other on that one. But I think, like I said, the main thing we should take away from this speech is what he is saying about the multipolar world order in the future and the West, meaning the countries that control the hard assets, the energy, the commodities, and the countries that control the financial economy having to come together, whether or not, you know, whether it's reluctantly, whether the West is in a position of power or not, inevitably they got to come to the bargaining table because they just are at the mercy of energy, because energy is the economy. All right, guys, enjoy the rest of your afternoon. As always, make sure that you're standing up for freedom, liberty, free market to capitalism. We'll see you in the next video.